I think it's an inaccurate paper that basically was part of a narrative that they were creating. Remember, this pandemic did not start in January at the seafood market. We now know there was infections all the way back into September. This was a narrative that was decided that they were going to say this came from the wet market, and they were going to do everything they could to support it, to negate any discussion about the possibility that this came from a laboratory.
I got 20 seconds.
Remember, this pandemic did not start in January at the seafood market. We now know there was infections all the way back into September.
And yes, you heard Dr. Redfield correct. As early as September 2019, as he said, we now know, that is when this viral outbreak began. And then in October of 2019, after September, they had the World Military Games held in Wuhan, China. And it consisted of 140 different nations from all around the world, 9,308 athletes, 316 events in 27 sports, and it opened on October 18th. That was the opening ceremony, and the closing ceremony was on October 27th, 2019. And it was held at the Wuhan Sports Center. They also had the Wuhan Athletic Village that was put in place to house the people that competed in these World Military Games. Also involved are many spectators that came to watch these from around the world, and, of course, the people that worked the venue. So let's start right here is where the Wuhan Institute of Virology is. It's located right here. And then down here, over to the left a little bit, is where the Wuhan Sports Center is, and many of the athletes competed in this area, which is a 35-minute drive from the Wuhan lab. And then over here is where they housed all the athletes, the 9,000 athletes that competed in the World Military Games were housed right here. And if you zoom in on the map, the actual landscape map, you'll find that there is a chicken farm right above here. We'll do that in a second. We'll zoom in on that. But the drive time between here and the Wuhan Lab of Virology, if you type this in, you don't get a drive time. It says can't be found. But you can if you type in this Suco Lake Residential District, which we'll do. We'll find the drive time. So here's your drive time from the World Military Games Village. And, of course, the lab is right here. We got 31-minute drive time, 17.9 kilometers in distance from where the athletes were staying to the Wuhan Lab of Virology. So let's go over here and check out the drive time from the Sports Center, which is right here. And we see that the drive time is right here. You got to cross over the river. But of course, we're going to go over to the left here. And over on the left, you see that it is 25 kilometers, 23 kilometers, 36-minute drive time. And that is the route from where the Wuhan lab is over here to where the Wuhan Sports Center. So that just gives you a factual understanding of how close these athletes were to the Wuhan Lab of Virology in Wuhan, China. Now, in this great, ever-expanding world of deception, it's hard to know who to trust and believe for what is being said when we find out that the so-called conspiracy theorists were more right than wrong. I would say they're about 90% right in regards to what has been said about this, that, and the other thing. But you got one from Sky News here. COVID-19 circulated in Italy as early as September 2019. Another one from CGTN. COVID-19 was spreading in Italy by September 19, study shows. And you can find numerous articles. The New York Post put one out. COVID-19 may have been in Italy as early as September 2019. And there's many other news sources out there that are reporting on this. And as we heard from Dr. Redfield, we know now that the coronavirus had been out and about as early as September. I'll put a couple of links down in the description to these news stories. I'll put the New York Post link down in the description. You can read that in regards to the study that found that the COVID was out in September of 2019. And if so, why in the world would we be going to Wuhan, China, with 140 different nations? They knew that the World Military Games were going to be held many, many months before the opening ceremony. They should have canceled it flat out, because to me, in my honest opinion, now this is just my opinion, but that was the World Super Spreader event. Seek the truth daily, my friends. The truth will find you seeking.
Now we see mounting evidence supporting the COVID-19 originated from the lab in Wuhan, China, run by the Communist Chinese Party. And this hearing is about getting to the truth. I thank the chairman for making this the very first hearing, because the American people who have seen just as many fellow Americans die from COVID, as nearly as many die from COVID, that died in every war since the American Revolution combined, deserve to know the truth. Dr. Redfield, you pointed to the lab leak theory even before we did. In mid-January of 2020, you expressed concerns to Dr. Fauci, to Jeremy Farrar of UK's Wellcome Trust, and to Dr. Tedros of World Health Organization that, quote, we had to take the lab leak hypothesis with extreme seriousness. And you urged Dr. Fauci to investigate both the lab and the natural hypotheses. Shortly thereafter, on February 1st, Farrar convened a meeting of a group of 11 top scientists across 5 time zones and asked Dr. Fauci to join, and he wrote, quote, my preference is to keep this group really tight. Obviously, ask everyone to treat in total confidence, unquote. Dr. Redfield, you were excluded from this call, but up until then, you had been on you were included in every other conversation. What changed? Why do you think that you were excluded from these conversations?
Thank you very much. I think just to emphasize, in early to mid-January, I did have multiple calls with Fauci, Farrar, and Tedros about how important I thought it was that science get engaged in aggressively pursuing both hypotheses. I also expressed, as a clinical virologist, that I felt it was not scientifically plausible that this virus went from a bat to humans and became one of the most infectious viruses that we have for humans. All viruses are not the same. So when you look at coronaviruses, for SARS and MERS, for example, when they entered the human species, which they did via an intermediate, they never learned how to go human to human. Even to this day, they don't know how to go human to human. So you can't equate Ebola with a coronavirus.
Now, why do you think you were excluded from those calls?
Because it was told to me that they wanted a single narrative, and that I obviously had a different point of view.
Okay. In emails following the conference call, 4 of the 11 scientists told Fauci that they all found the genetic sequence inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory, basically what you're saying. However, just 3 days later, these 4 scientists had drafted a paper arguing the exact opposite, and that's now the infamous proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2. Our investigations show that this paper was prompted by Dr. Fauci, among others, with a goal to disprove the lab leak theory. What is the likelihood that these scientists came across additional information just 3 days after making these statements to conclude with such certainty that COVID-19 came from nature instead of the lab leak that they thought it was 3 days earlier?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate. Again, I've said this before, that this whole approach that was taken on February 1st, and subsequently in the month of February, if you really want to be truthful, it's antithetical to science.
Thank you.
Science has debate, and they squashed any debate.
Thank you. Given what we know now and looking at all the conversations in February of 2020 and before the release of the paper, do you think that Dr. Fauci used this paper to hide the gain-of-function research created this virus?
I can't talk about Fauci's motivation.
Do you think that the paper does hide the truth?
I think it's an inaccurate paper that basically was part of a narrative that they were creating. Remember, this pandemic did not start in January at the seafood market. We now know there was infections all the way back into September. This was a narrative that was decided that they were going to say this came from the wet market, and they were going to do everything they could to support it, to negate any discussion about the possibility that this came from a laboratory.
I got 20 seconds left. Dr. Fauci was affirmatively told in an email that NIAID had a monetary relationship with the Wuhan Institute through EcoHealth Alliance. He was told this in January 27th of 2020. Do you think that Dr. Fauci intentionally lied under oath to Senator Paul when he vehemently denied NIH's funding of gain-of-function research?
I think there's no doubt that NIH was funding gain-of-function research.
Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain-of-function research that created this virus?
I think it did, not only from NIH, but from the State Department, USAID, and from DOD.
I'm out of time. Thank you very much.